In front of dozens of coworkers scattered across the open office floor, CEO Erica Sanders dropped a resignation letter onto the desk of Mark Ellison, a quiet single father who had spent years working at the company. She declared, right there in front of everyone, that he was finished, that he no longer matched the culture she was building, and then had security walk him out. Every person on that floor assumed the quiet man would crumble under the humiliation. Instead, he picked up the envelope and left without saying a single word. What could make a man who'd just been publicly destroyed that calm? The Hartwell Global Tower looked the same as it always did that morning, 42 stories of glass and steel rising above the financial district, the kind of building where careers were made and broken before noon. Mark Ellison walked in at 7:15, just like he had for years, his plain leather bag over one shoulder and a coffee from the cart on the corner in his hand. No one in the lobby gave him a second glance. That was exactly how he liked it. Mark was in his mid-40s, tall, soft-spoken, with a face people tended to forget within an hour of meeting him. His suits were well-tailored but plain, gray, unremarkable. He talked so little around the office that newer hires sometimes guessed he was an outside auditor or someone from legal handling paperwork nobody else wanted to touch. He raised his daughter alone and ran his whole life with the same quiet discipline, no noise, no explanations owed to anyone. What almost nobody on that floor realized was that Mark Ellison sat on Hartwell Global's board of directors. He held the title but rarely showed up to executive sessions, and years earlier he'd specifically asked that his name be left off the company website and out of any press material. To the people who worked around him, he was just a long-tenured staffer in strategic planning, a man who read documents, asked pointed questions, and left on time. There was a reason behind the silence, and it traced back to the man who'd built the place. David Whitman had founded Hartwell Global decades before on borrowed money and a stubborn insistence on doing things the right way. Mark had worked at his side for years, first as an analyst, later as the one person Whitman trusted with problems he couldn't hand to anyone else. When Whitman died with no family left to speak of, the reading of his will stunned even the attorneys in the room. He left Mark 51% of the voting shares, controlling interest, the sole authority to decide who ran the company and how. Mark could have taken the top office the moment the estate settled. Instead, he did something almost nobody in his position would do. He handed full operational control to the executive board, folded his ownership into a private holding entity to keep it quiet, and stepped back into the shadows. He believed the company needed to run on its own systems, not the preferences of a single owner. Whitman had built an institution, and Mark intended to guard it as one, not rule it like a kingdom. So life at the company moved forward, and eventually the board needed a new CEO. That's when Erica Sanders arrived. Everyone called Erica brilliant, mostly because she made certain they did. She came in with a track record of explosive growth at 2 other firms, a reputation for closing deals nobody else could land, and a presence that took over any room she walked into. In her late 30s then, sharp, polished, she was the type of executive who remembered the name of anyone useful and forgot everyone else on site. Most of the board saw a rising star. Growth charts, media coverage, a face that fit the company's future. The vote to install her happened on a Thursday afternoon, years before this story starts, and it came back nearly unanimous. Nearly. One ballot went against her. Board votes at Hartwell were logged but never read aloud by name, so the room never learned publicly whose no it was. It was Mark's. He'd sat through her pitch, listened to how she answered questions, and noticed something the rest of the room missed. When a junior analyst pushed back on one of her numbers, she smiled, thanked him, and had him pulled off the account within the week.
When a veteran director floated a slower rollout timeline, she agreed pleasantly in the room and mocked him at dinner later that night. Mark saw the shape underneath the shine, a leader who treated any disagreement as a personal insult, who ran on ego dressed up as strategy. He believed that kind of pride, handed enough power and enough time, would eventually cost the company something it couldn't get back. So he voted no, said nothing further, and accepted it when the majority carried her through. Erica found out about that dissenting vote eventually. Information like that always finds a way out. She never learned who Mark actually was. His ownership stayed buried inside the sealed holding structure and the board's private records, but she learned enough to know the quiet strategic planning guy with a board seat had been the lone voice against her, and she filed it away as a debt to be collected someday. To her, he was nobody. Some sentimental leftover from the founder's era, a man with a board seat he barely used and no real leverage behind it. More than once, over drinks after late meetings, she told her inner circle exactly that. An old friend of David Whitman, a nostalgic appointment, a man who votes no because he's afraid of the future. She was sure he had no actual power, and certainty was the fuel Erica Sanders ran on. The years that followed proved her both talented and exactly what Mark had feared, though only one of those truths was visible from outside the building. Revenue kept climbing, magazines ran profiles calling her a visionary, and inside the walls, quietly, methodically, she began remaking Hartwell Global around herself. It started with people. Executives who'd challenged her early on found their departments quietly dismantled out from under them. A CFO who raised concerns about a risky acquisition got a glowing public send-off and a private ultimatum, gone within 6 months, replaced by a man whose entire career belonged to her. Department heads learned fast that agreement was how you survived and flattery was how you got promoted. One by one, the people willing to tell her no left the building, and everyone who stayed learned never to try. Mark watched from his board seat. He was one of the few people she couldn't simply remove, since board seats weren't hers to hand out or take away, which made him, without either of them saying it out loud, the last steady source of resistance in her world. When she pushed an aggressive expansion into markets the company barely understood, Mark picked apart the risk models line by line. When she tried to gut the internal audit team to trim costs, he forced a formal vote and stalled it. When turnover among her direct reports hit numbers that would alarm any healthy company, Mark calmly asked, on the record, whether the board should take a closer look at the culture at the top. He never raised his voice, he never made it personal. He showed up with documents and let the documents speak. That restraint made things worse for her, not better. Erica could go toe-to-toe with anger. She had no answer for patience. Every board meeting where Mark spoke felt, to her, like an audit of her character, conducted by a man she considered beneath her. And the resentment stacked up quarter after quarter, like interest on unpaid debt. Her circle kept feeding the fire, telling her Mark was chipping away at her authority, that staff whispered about the board member who didn't respect her. None of it was quite true the way they framed it, but Erica had long since stopped separating truth from what was useful to believe. Somewhere along the way, Mark Ellison stopped being an inconvenience in her mind and became a symbol, the one crack in her control, the living reminder that one person in that building had looked at her and voted no, and Erica decided it was finally time to make an example of him. She chose her method with intention. A quiet dismissal would have solved the practical problem, but Erica didn't want practical. She wanted a public lesson for every manager and employee in the building about what happened to people who crossed her. She genuinely believed Mark was just a stubborn staffer with a ceremonial title, that the board would grumble and move on, and that the fear rippling through the office afterward would buy her years of unchallenged control. So, on an ordinary morning at 9:40, Erica Sanders stepped off the executive elevator onto the strategic planning floor, flanked by her head of HR and two security officers. Conversations died out row by row as she crossed the floor. People stood at their desks to watch. She walked straight to Mark Ellison's desk, where he sat reviewing a risk report with his reading glasses on, and set a single white envelope in front of him. Inside was a resignation letter, already typed with his name at the bottom, waiting only for a signature. Her voice carried across the whole floor, clear, controlled, aimed at the audience rather than at him. She told him his employment was terminated, effective immediately. She said the company had decided he no longer fit the culture it was building. She said his outdated thinking had held the organization back long enough, and that Hartwell needed people who believed in its future instead of fearing it. Then she waved the security officers forward and told them to walk him out. The floor went completely still. Dozens of people watched, some with phones half raised, some frozen mid-step with coffee in hand. Everyone understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't a termination, it was a public execution, staged for maximum humiliation, and the man on the receiving end was a quiet father in his 40s who had never once raised his voice in that building. Mark set down his glasses on the risk report, looked at the envelope, then looked up at Erica. For a moment, they simply regarded each other while the entire floor held its breath. In that instant, Mark stood at a fork only he could see. He knew exactly what was in his power. He could stand up right then and end the whole performance with one sentence. He could tell the floor who he was, tell her what 51% of the voting shares meant, and watch the color drain from her face in front of the very audience she'd assembled to witness his downfall. It would have been fully justified. Part of him, the human part, wanted that badly. But Mark had spent years thinking about power, about what it did to the people who reached for it and the people who held it. He thought about David Whitman, who had trusted him with control precisely because Mark never hungered for it. He thought about what it would mean to win this moment through exposure, matching her public spectacle with a personal weapon of his own, settling a private score in front of a crowd. And then he thought of something colder and clearer. Erica Sanders had just fired a sitting board member with zero authority to do so, publicly, procedurally, on the record, in front of dozens of witnesses. She hadn't made a cruel decision. She'd made a catastrophic one, and she had no idea yet. If he revealed himself now, this became a duel between two people. If he stayed silent, it remained exactly what it already was, an unforced act of executive misconduct that the company's own systems, the ones he'd spent years protecting, would have to answer. She had built this stage herself. He decided to let her keep standing on it. So Mark said nothing. He closed the risk report and squared its edges. He picked up the unsigned envelope and slid it into his bag, along with his glasses. He took his coat off the back of his chair and put it on with no more urgency than a man stepping out for lunch. Then he stood, gave the two security officers a single nod, as if to spare them the discomfort of their assignment, and walked toward the elevators through a corridor of stunned faces. Erica watched him go, and his calm rattled her for one brief second before her confidence smoothed it back over. She expected pleading or anger, or at least the shaky dignity of a broken man. She got nothing, and told herself nothing meant surrender. She turned to the silent floor, let her gaze sweep across the rows like a warning, and headed back to the executive elevator with her people trailing behind. Behind her, whispers started before the doors had even shut. Nobody said it out loud, but more than one person on that floor sensed something wrong, a mismatch between the scale of the humiliation and the stillness of the man who'd absorbed it. People who are truly powerless don't walk out like that. A few of the longer-tenured employees, the ones who remembered the founder's era, traded glances they didn't bother to explain.
Down in the lobby, Mark crossed the marble floor at an unhurried pace, past reception, past the Hartwell Global lettering on the wall, out through the revolving doors into the cold morning air. The security officers stopped at the threshold, unsure of themselves, because the man they'd been sent to remove had somehow made the whole thing look like his own decision. On the sidewalk, Mark stood for a moment and looked up at the tower, 42 floors of glass that David Whitman had dreamed into existence, and that Mark himself now controlled more completely than anyone inside understood. He felt no triumph, no anger. What he felt was closer to sorrow, the specific sorrow of watching someone build their own downfall by hand and mistake it for a win. The envelope in his bag wasn't a resignation letter, whatever the paper said. It was evidence, a signed, witnessed confession of everything he'd warned the board about for years, delivered by Erica Sanders herself in front of dozens of witnesses on company property, on the record. She believed she'd just ended the career of the only person who'd ever voted against her. In reality, she'd just fired the majority owner of the company, and the consequences were already in motion. Mark turned up his collar against the wind and walked away without looking back, a quiet man with 51% of a company in his pocket and all the time in the world to let the truth surface on its own schedule. That evening, on the top floor of a restaurant overlooking the river, Erica celebrated. Her inner circle filled a long table, her head of HR, her COO, Kevin Reeves, half a dozen division leaders who owed her their careers. Glasses went up. Someone toasted a new era at Hartwell Global. Erica wore the smile the magazines loved, the smile of a woman who believed she'd just cleared the last obstacle between herself and total control. The flattery flowed as freely as the wine. Kevin declared the company had needed this cleansing for years, that the old guard had been dead weight. The head of HR praised the courage it took to make hard calls in public, calling it transparent leadership. Everyone at that table understood the real lesson of the morning. Loyalty to Erica is the only currency that mattered, and each of them spent the evening paying it in full. Erica absorbed every word and believed it because it was the only kind of truth she'd let near her in years. The one voice that had ever told her no was gone. She thought about Mark's silence as he left and read it as proof of weakness. The stubborn old board member had finally understood he was beaten and hadn't even had the spine to argue. Within days, the building was visibly different. Managers who'd quietly leaned on Mark's questions to slow down risky calls had nowhere left to send their doubts. Projects he'd spent years holding back started moving one after another like water through a broken dam. Kevin Reeves revived the aggressive overseas expansion Mark had once picked apart in front of the board, and this time nobody picked it apart. The company committed $200 million to markets it barely understood. The plan to gut internal audit, which Mark had once slowed with a formal vote, got quietly implemented under a new name, dressed up as streamlining. Risk reviews that used to take weeks got compressed into days, then into signatures on documents nobody fully read. The building learned a new language. In meetings, disagreement vanished entirely. Executives competed to guess what Erica wanted before she said it, and the best guessers rose fastest. Hartwell Global, an institution David Whitman had built on systems and discipline, was quietly becoming something else, a machine that ran on one woman's instincts and everyone else's fear.
From outside, it still looked like a thriving company. Inside, the people old enough to remember the founders' era kept their heads down and quietly updated their resumes. Mark watched none of it happen, and all of it happen at once. He no longer had a desk in strategic planning, but he remained exactly what he'd always been, a board member and, invisibly, the controlling shareholder. From his quiet house across town, he received the board packets he was legally entitled to and read them the way he read everything, slowly, completely, pencil in hand. He didn't call the press. He didn't call a lawyer to threaten anyone. He made exactly one phone call that first week to Robert Hayes, the senior-most director and the last board member left over from Whitman's era. The call lasted 4 minutes. Mark described what happened on the strategic planning floor, plainly, without embellishment, and asked one question. Did the board intend to address the fact that the CEO had publicly terminated a sitting board director with no authority to do so? Robert was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said he'd heard rumors, but not the full truth of it, and that he'd verify everything. Then, carefully, he asked the question that actually mattered, whether Mark intended to respond as a director or something more. Mark told him he intended to follow procedure, nothing more and nothing less, and that the company's own rules would be enough. Robert understood exactly what that meant, because he was one of the very few people alive who knew what Mark actually held. The machinery started turning quietly. Robert Hayes pulled the personnel file and the security log from that morning. He discreetly interviewed 3 employees who'd witnessed the scene. What he found was worse than the rumors. The CEO hadn't just pushed out a staffer. She'd staged the public termination of a sitting board director with a security escort in front of dozens of witnesses, citing culture fit, with no board consultation, no legal review, and no authority whatsoever. 11 days after Mark walked out of the building, the board convened an emergency session. The notice cited an urgent governance matter. Erica showed up confident anyway, assuming governance was just formal language for approving her overseas expansion, presentation folder in hand, carrying the easy assurance of a woman who hadn't been contradicted in almost 2 weeks. The boardroom on the 40th floor held a long table, 12 chairs, and windows overlooking the city. Robert Hayes sat at the head, flanked by the other directors. Beside him sat Susan Klein, the company's general counsel, a woman Erica had spent years keeping at arm's length, with a sealed folder in front of her. Erica took her seat, opened her folder, and started talking about logistics corridors. Robert stopped her before she finished her second sentence. He said the session had been called for a different reason. He stated for the record that on the morning of the 4th, the CEO had publicly terminated Mark Ellison and had him escorted from the building. Then he asked her a single question, delivered without any heat at all. On what authority had she removed a sitting member of the board of directors? The question didn't land at first. Erica actually smiled, a small, confused smile, and said Mark Ellison held an honorary seat, a courtesy carried over from the founders' era, and that his employment was an operational matter within her discretion. She said the board should be thanking her. Nobody said a word. The silence in the room had a texture she'd never felt before. The silence of people watching someone stand on ground about to disappear beneath them. Robert nodded to Susan Klein, and she opened the sealed folder, reading in the flat, careful cadence of a lawyer stating facts that couldn't be argued with. Mark Ellison's board seat was not honorary. It was a full, properly recorded, continuously held voting directorship. His removal was procedurally void, but that, she said, was the smaller problem. Then she turned to the shareholder registry, the confidential ledger tied to the private holding structure set up after David Whitman's death, and read the controlling entry aloud. The entity holding 51% of the voting shares, the majority interest, the final word on every seat at that table, including Erica's own, belonged in full to one beneficiary. Susan said the name slowly and clearly: Mark Ellison. The folder sat open on the table, and Erica stared at it as understanding moved through her like something physical. The color drained from her face by degrees. Her presentation, with its charts about logistics corridors, suddenly belonged to a different lifetime. She reached for words and found none, because there were none. The quiet man in the gray suit, the stubborn holdover, the powerless relic she'd humiliated in front of the entire company, owned the company. Susan kept going because the record required it. Mr. Ellison had inherited controlling interest directly from the founder. He had voluntarily handed all operational authority to the executive board and had deliberately kept his position confidential at his own request so the company could govern itself. Every salary in the building, every decision, every appointment had existed for years inside a space Mark Ellison had chosen, freely, not to touch. Then Robert Hayes added the detail that closed the loop, one piece of history the sealed board records had always contained. In the vote that made Erica CEO all those years earlier, the single dissenting ballot in a room full of approval had been cast by the controlling shareholder himself. The one person with the unilateral power to deny her the job had voted no, and had been outvoted by the rest of the board. He could have overruled them. He accepted the result anyway because he trusted the process more than his own judgment. Erica sat motionless as the full shape of her situation assembled itself around her. The man she'd destroyed in public had held her career in his hands from day one and never once used that power against her. He'd questioned her in board meetings when he could have simply removed her. He'd submitted to votes he could have dictated outright, and she'd answered years of that restraint by staging his humiliation in front of dozens of witnesses, on the record, for the crime of disagreeing with her. The meeting ended with a formal resolution voiding the termination and opening a governance review into the CEO's conduct. Erica walked out of that boardroom into a building that already felt different, because news like that never stays sealed. By the next morning, everyone at Hartwell Global who mattered knew the quiet man from strategic planning owned 51% of everything. What came next was territory Erica knew well, the fight to survive, except she'd never fought one from underneath before. Her first move was to reframe the story. In a hastily called meeting with her executive team, she called the termination an administrative error, a miscommunication between HR and legal that had unfortunately played out in public. She said HR had prepared the file without proper vetting. She said legal should have flagged the board seat. She spread the blame carefully across everyone in the room except herself. But the room had changed. Kevin Reeves, who'd toasted the cleansing of the old guard 2 weeks ago, now stared at the table and said almost nothing. The head of HR, hearing herself blamed for an error she'd been ordered to carry out, went pale, and that same afternoon quietly began forwarding emails to her own attorney. Emails in which the CEO had personally directed every detail of the public termination, security escort included. Around the executive floor, the people who'd risen by anticipating Erica's wishes started anticipating something else entirely, and one by one they began putting distance between themselves and her. Feeling the ground shift, Erica reached for the only move she had left. She tried to get to Mark directly. She called the number in the board directory and got a voicemail that never called back. She wrote a long email proposing a private conversation to clear the air, and 2 days later got a 3-line reply from Susan Klein's office stating that Mr. Ellison would communicate on governance matters exclusively through formal board channels. She sent a handwritten letter to the holding entity's registered address, offering apologies she'd never offered anyone in her life. It went unanswered. The silence was strategy, and part of her knew it. A private meeting would have given her exactly what she needed: a stage to perform contrition for an audience of one, a chance to negotiate, to charm, to salvage something. Mark denied her that stage the same way she'd denied him a single word of warning. Everything would happen in the open, through process, on the record, in front of the institution she'd spent years bending to her will. He wasn't taking revenge. He was doing something she found far more frightening: letting the rules she broke do exactly what rules are built to do.
The next board session, an extraordinary one, landed on a Tuesday morning, and this time the notice named its subject plainly: Review of Executive Conduct. Erica arrived early and sat alone at the long table, and for the first time in her career at Hartwell Global, she watched the door, not knowing what would walk through it. At 9:02, Mark Ellison walked in, not as a terminated employee, not as a quiet director, but formally, for the first time in his life, as the controlling shareholder of Hartwell Global. He wore the same kind of gray suit he always wore. He carried the same plain leather bag. He took a seat, nodded once, and set down his glasses and a single thick folder. The room, full of the most powerful people at the company, went as silent as the strategic planning floor had gone the morning this all began. What followed over the next 2 hours was quiet, methodical, and devastating. The folder held the record, every piece of it laid out without a single raised voice: the public termination of a sitting director, documented by witness statements and the security log; the pattern of retaliation stretching back years; the executives who'd asked questions and were restructured into exile; the CFO forced out for flagging an acquisition; the audit team dismantled under a fake name; the email chain, produced through counsel, in which Erica had personally choreographed every detail of the public humiliation on the strategic planning floor. Then Mark spoke for the first time in that building since the morning he'd walked out of it. He confirmed, calmly and for the record, why he'd cast that dissenting ballot years earlier: that he'd seen, even then, a leader who treated disagreement as a threat to eliminate rather than information to weigh, and believed that kind of pride, given power and time, would eventually cost the company something it couldn't afford. He said he genuinely hoped, across all those years, to be proven wrong. He looked at the folder, then at Erica, and said the evidence in front of the board was the answer to that hope. Nobody defended her. That was the detail that broke something in Erica Sanders. More than the documents, more than the shareholder registry, more than the vote she could already see coming. She looked around the table and through the glass wall toward the executive floor beyond it, at Kevin Reeves, at every division head, at every person who'd toasted her at that restaurant over the river, and not one of them met her eyes. The machine she'd built out of flattery and fear had one design flaw she'd never accounted for. It was loyal to power, and she was no longer where the power sat. Sitting in that silence, Erica finally understood the full shape of what she'd done. She hadn't been taken down by an enemy. Mark Ellison had never once moved against her in all the years he could have ended her with a signature. She'd been undone by her own decisions, her own staging,
her own need to make an example of the one man who'd told her the truth. She had walked 51% of the company to the elevator in front of dozens of witnesses, and the quiet man had simply let her. The vote of confidence was set for the following Monday, and the week in between became the longest of Erica Sanders' professional life. She spent it doing what she'd always done best, fighting, except every weapon she reached for fell apart in her hands. She called directors one by one, asking for private conversations, and found private conversations no longer existed for her. 2 declined the call outright. 1 listened politely for 10 minutes, then said tiredly that the documents spoke for themselves. Robert Hayes agreed to meet her in person, and when she sat across from him and started explaining the pressures of leadership and the necessity of hard calls, the old man let her finish completely before responding. He told her the board wasn't voting on a hard decision. Hard decisions were part of the job, and every person at that table had made them. The board was voting on years of retaliation dressed up as management, on an audit function dismantled in the dark, on a CFO punished for telling the truth, and on the public humiliation of a man whose only offense in all the years Robert had known him was voting his conscience once and asking honest questions ever since. Then Robert said something that stayed with her longer than any document had. He said the saddest part from where he sat was that none of it had been necessary. Her results were real. Her talent was real. She could have led that company for 20 years if she'd simply let one man disagree with her. Erica left his office and sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time without starting the engine. Somewhere in that concrete silence, the last of her excuses ran out, and what remained underneath them was the truth she'd been outrunning since the general counsel first opened that sealed folder. Her downfall hadn't started the morning she handed Mark a resignation letter. It hadn't even started with the dissenting vote all those years earlier. It had started every single day in between. In every executive she'd exiled for questioning her, in every meeting where she rewarded agreement and punished honesty, in the 1,000 small choices that had slowly, thoroughly proven Mark's read of her correct. That was the wound that wouldn't close. The vote against her had never been a verdict. It was a warning, cast by a man who then stepped back and gave her years of room to prove it wrong. Erica had spent her entire tenure turning it decision by decision into prophecy. Mark Ellison hadn't defeated her. She had spent years building his case for him, and then, in front of dozens of witnesses, delivered the closing argument herself. Mark spent that same week differently. Anyone watching from outside might have expected satisfaction from a man in his position, and there was none to find. He sat at his kitchen table with the board material spread out in front of him, and what he felt reading through the wreckage of the past several years was closer to self-examination than victory, because the record indicted him, too, in its own way. Page after page documented things that had happened while he held absolute power to stop them. The forced departure of the CFO, the gutted audit team, the $200 million committed to overseas markets in the 11 days after his removal, a commitment the company would now spend years unwinding.
He'd told himself, through all of it, that his restraint was principle, that the institution had to govern itself, that a controlling owner ruling from the shadows was no better than a CEO ruling through fear. But sitting with the full record in front of him, Mark made himself face the cost of that principle honestly. His silence had been so complete that it had stopped protecting the company and started exposing it. Nobody in the building understood his role, so nobody understood there was a limit at all. Good people had watched the culture rot and concluded that no one with real power cared.
Erica herself had walked into catastrophe partly because he'd hidden the guardrail she crashed into. There was a lesson in the wreckage for her, and he didn't pretend there wasn't one for him, too. Invisible accountability, he wrote in the margin of one document, eventually becomes no accountability. He intended to say it out loud, on the record, when the moment came. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. The board convened at 9, every seat at the long table filled, Susan Klein recording the minutes, and Mark Ellison present in his formal capacity as controlling shareholder, though he'd recused himself from the vote itself, so no one could ever claim the outcome had been dictated by ownership. Erica entered last, and the room noticed the change in her before she said a word. The armor of the past several years, the polish, the certainty, the presence that used to fill a room, had worn thin. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked, for the first time in anyone's memory, like someone waiting to hear a verdict she already knew. Robert Hayes ran the proceeding with the formality it deserved. The findings of the governance review went into the record. Erica was offered the chance to respond, and here she surprised the room. She didn't deploy the administrative error defense. She didn't spread blame across HR, legal, or the directors who'd approved her initiatives. In a steady voice, she said the record was accurate, that the decisions in it had been hers, and that she'd spent the past week understanding things about herself she should have understood years earlier. She said she would accept the board's judgment. It was the most honest moment of her tenure, and everyone in the room understood it had arrived too late to save her, and that she knew that too. The vote of confidence went around the table. One by one, the 11 voting directors answered, and the responses fell like slow, evenly spaced footsteps. No confidence, no confidence, no confidence. 11 ballots, not one in her favor. The woman who'd been carried into office by a near-unanimous board left it the same way, unanimous, in the opposite direction. Susan Klein recorded the result. Robert Hayes formally moved for removal. The motion carried, and it was done. Erica Sanders was no longer CEO of Hartwell Global. Then the room turned toward what came next, and every eye landed on Mark. The logic of the moment felt obvious to everyone present. He owned 51% of the company. He'd been proven right about everything, and he understood the institution more deeply than anyone alive. Robert Hayes asked him directly for the record whether the controlling shareholder wished to take the CEO role himself. Mark took off his glasses, set them on the table, and said no, without hesitation. And then he explained, because the explanation was the whole point. He said the company had spent years learning what happens when too much power collects around one person, and that the cure for that couldn't be a different person holding even more of it. A CEO who was also the controlling owner would answer to no one at all, and Hartwell had already seen where unanswerable power led, regardless of the intentions behind it. David Whitman hadn't left him 51% so he could sit on a throne. He'd left it to him as a fire extinguisher, and a fire extinguisher belongs on the wall, not in the middle of the room. Then Mark laid out, in the same plain, methodical way he laid out everything, what he proposed instead. For the CEO role, he put forward a name that made several directors sit up straight. Laura Bennett, the former CFO, the woman Erica had forced out years earlier for flagging concerns about an acquisition that had since proven exactly as risky as she had warned. In the years since, Laura had run a smaller firm known for discipline and low turnover, and she carried something nobody in the current executive suite had: a documented history of telling powerful people the truth at real personal cost. The board would vet her properly and vote freely. Mark said clearly that this was a recommendation, not an order, and he wanted that difference on the record. Then came the reforms, the part Mark had spent his week at the kitchen table writing. The internal audit department would be rebuilt, fully staffed, reporting directly to the board instead of any executive. No director could ever again be terminated, demoted, or disciplined by executive action alone. A formal dissent protocol would be written into the governance charter, guaranteeing protection for any officer or director who raised documented concerns about a decision, with retaliation treated as a removable offense. And finally, the reform that cost Mark the most personally. The identity and role of the controlling shareholder would no longer be confidential. His name would go into the governance records available to the board and senior leadership, because, as he told the room plainly, he'd learned something from all of this too. He believed hiding his power kept it from corrupting the company. He understood now that hiding it had only let people forget there was a line anywhere at all. That, he said, was his share of the failure, and he was correcting it on the record. The board adopted the framework, and as the meeting moved toward adjournment, Mark did the one thing nobody expected. As the directors gathered their papers, he asked for one more minute and turned to Erica Sanders, who had sat through the reforms in silence, waiting to be dismissed from the building her ambition nearly consumed. He spoke to her directly, quietly, in front of the room, because she made her choices in front of a room, and he believed she deserved to hear this the same way. He told her the vote he had cast against her years ago was never a verdict carved in stone. It was a concern, nothing more, one man's read of a pattern he genuinely hoped he was misreading. He told her something she could never have known, that on the day she was appointed over his objection, he had privately decided to watch, to stay out of her way, and to be the first person to admit he'd been wrong about her the moment she proved it. He said he had wanted to be wrong. He had spent years wanting it. A company is always better off when its owner's worst prediction fails.
Then he said the sentence everyone in that room would remember. He said that, in the end, she was the one who'd settled the question, because every choice she'd made, year after year, had been an argument for that old ballot. And the morning she staged his humiliation in front of his colleagues, she'd proven the vote right beyond any appeal he could have offered. He wasn't saying it to hurt her. His voice carried no triumph at all. He said it because it was the truest thing he knew about power, and she was, in that moment, the one person on earth positioned to fully understand it. Erica held his gaze through all of it. When he finished, she nodded once, slowly, the way people nod at a sentence they know they'll carry for the rest of their lives. She stood, with whatever composure she had left, and walked out of the 40th floor boardroom, past the glass wall, past the executive suite that wasn't hers anymore, into the elevator and down through the lobby, where, weeks earlier, 2 security officers had walked a quiet man out through the revolving doors. No one escorted her. Somehow, that made the walk longer. The months that followed proved the reforms were more than words on paper. Laura Bennett was vetted, interviewed, and confirmed by a real vote, and she returned to Hartwell Global with a mandate she used carefully. The overseas expansion got restructured before it could metastasize into a $200 million disaster.
The audit department reopened on the 8th floor, and within the first quarter, an analyst used the new dissent protocol to challenge a pricing decision, and instead of vanishing from the account, she was thanked in writing, and the call got revised. People notice things like that. Companies always do. Slowly, meeting by meeting, quarter by quarter, the employees of Hartwell Global relearned something they'd forgotten under the old regime, that telling the truth upward was survivable, then valuable, then expected. Mark Ellison settled back into the life he'd always preferred. His name now sat in the governance records, and senior leadership knew exactly who he was, but he attended board meetings as one voice among many, asked his careful questions, and went home on time. He never took an executive office, he never gave an interview. Twice in the years that followed, matters came up that touched the company's core principles, and twice the fire extinguisher came off the wall, briefly, decisively, and then went back up. That was all. The single father in the gray suit remained the most powerful person in a 42-story building and the most invisible one in it, and he considered that combination the whole point. Erica Sanders left the city that spring. The story followed her, the way these stories always do, but so did something else, the unglamorous work of becoming a different kind of person. She eventually took a role at a mid-sized firm in another state, well below the level she'd lost, reporting to people who asked her hard questions. Those who worked with her in the years afterward described a leader almost recognizable from the old magazine profiles, one who sought out disagreement, kept skeptics close, and was heard more than once telling a young manager, "But the most valuable person in any room is the one willing to vote against you." She never explained where that lesson came from. She never had to, because she understood, in a way very few people ever earned the right to understand, what her career had finally taught her. Titles are rented. Power is borrowed. The applause of people who fear you is worthless on the day the fear lifts. A leader is measured not by the loyalty of the people who agree with her, but how she treats the one who doesn't. And pride can carry a person to the top of a 42-story building faster than almost anything else on earth. It simply can't keep them there. Only humility can do that. Humility, respect, and the discipline to actually listen. And the proof of it was a quiet man who owned 51% of everything and never once needed anyone to know.